Okay, we are going to demonstrate a couple of things different than the usual Hex Command Gunpowder, which is to say, the typical Hex Command Gunpowder game where one unit represents an entire battalion or a regiment. In this case, and also in the case of the Napoleonic Wars, our collections have been designed around one each base representing a company here in the American Revolution. But it could just as well also be a battalion, 2 battalions per regiment. But don't confuse the fact of the word battalion with a lot of men. The truth of the matter is, in the American Revolution, in the scale that we like to operate, we want to call these companies. To call them battalions, it would be misleading because the regiments weren't that big. And so they would consist of companies. And in the game, the manner of moving the units around would be by company because it's more interesting for the scale. But you could just simply say, just like in the Napoleonics, that every stand is a battalion, and who cares how many actual men are in it. But in the roster, we call them companies, and I think, as a matter of fact, they're labeled as companies um, on the actual basis. On some of these, you can't see because they're not done or they're not finished. Uh, they're not labeled properly yet. Some of them are called, 5th Virginia Company A or 5th Virginia A and then 5th Virginia B. And both of these are put onto a movement plate. And these are our 3D printed movement plates that make it a lot easier to move these units around that are comprised of multiple stands. In our case, we only have the 2 stands. So anything more than that would be too cumbersome. There is a possibility that if these are companies and you want to treat them in a scale of a company, then there might be more than 2 per regiment. And that would be a very big linear tactic type of game. Hence the reason we don't really do that. Here we try and maintain the fact that every hex represents about 50 yards, some maybe 25 yards. So the maximum range of the smoothbore muskets would not be anything greater than 300 yards, and if that, 200 yards would be the maximum range. And the same pretty much goes for Napoleonics as well. The difference, like I said, is that the Napoleonics, every stand is an actual battalion because they simply had more men. So there would be 2 battalions to a regiment. Here we're using the same thing, but we can call them companies if we like. We can call them battalions if we like. We'll stick with the word company because we may even forget to do that and start calling them other different things. But the fact is that's our intent. Okay, that again is a long-winded introduction into our situation. Sorry, but that's the way it is. This is a battle that we have designed for the RockCon game convention. Um, and we are basing the organization around the time of 1777, 78 for the American Revolution and the Battle of Brandywine. May not be the best order of battle that favors or enables the Americans to have a chance of winning. Perhaps 1778 would be better, maybe even 79. But the fact of the matter is, we're using the Brandywine 1777. That may not prove to be a smart move, but we're doing it. At least that's what we're initially researching right now to label the units. And of course, we can't do the entire American Army or the entire British Army, but we can get a pretty good chunk. And these small tables that we've designed since COVID enable us to have a microcosm look, a portion of the entire battlefield, and that's all we have time for. We don't have time for massive battles anymore. Very few people do. And so that's why our 4x3 table is working out so wonderfully. And again, as you're seeing here, there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of units on the table. And this may not be the actual amount of troops involved, because this would be a relatively longer game than an hour. We want to try and keep these games to less than 2 hours. So with this many troops and this much terrain and this complicated of a table, it might be difficult to stay within an hour and a half for other players. But for me, of course, it's just a matter of demonstrating bits and pieces. And of course, it never takes much time. But you can see by the movement of the units that these new movement plates that we 3D printed are actually absolutely fantastic. So we're so glad that we are able to do this. It's just simply a frame, 3D printed, and the units, the individual stands, are placed inside. It's just, it doesn't have an internal stand or base or cardboard. It's just a hollow frame. And so therefore, when it's not got units in it, it might be a little delicate, but it is pretty good plastic. So pretty stiff. And we've left the, by the way, the raft, as they call it on the printing process, the raft, we've left it on there because instead of printing this entire space full of plastic, we decided that worked, and that's how we're leaving it. Now, the same kind of concept here is working for our artillery bases, but our prototype is sufficient for the artillery bases to remain on, and that's what we're looking at here. Basically, it's a smoothbore gun base, and this is our prototypes. We made quite a few of these, so we're actually going to keep them for just this reason. The artillery bases, and in some cases maybe even cavalry, but it's not necessary because it just makes it convenient to move such a thing. These are one base only, so we don't really need a movement plate, but you know, it can make it a little easier than trying to grab the base off the game table. But these bases are 332 basswood. This is before we started using acrylic laser cut sheets, and these basswood stands are fine. So that's an example right there of our prototype. In this case, we're continuing to use it for the artillery. And why? Because if the base of the artillery isn't the same as the width and depth of two of these stands, because these are hollow, the artillery stand can't be used. It doesn't fit because we chose not to print the whole plastic hollow or base filled in. So it's just a frame. So these guys don't fit. Other artillery bases might. Here's an example. A British one that we mounted on a larger base is perfect. But we didn't do that for every case because this was an evolving collection. And once we started doing the artillery like this, we realized that the base was too small and we went to the larger base. Or it may have been that we didn't think it was necessary to have that small base and we went to a larger one for other reasons we don't remember, or at least I don't remember anyway. So that is the use of our movement plates. What we're going to continue to demonstrate after a quick break is that we will demonstrate the movement of the troops and the use of these individual companies, stands, and how that changes the basic operation of Hex Command Gunpowder. Another interesting note, we managed to find a nice print or a file for a tree, and instead of printing it as one whole piece, which would have taken time, we split it in half and put it on the 3D printer Platinum as two halves. This printed, if not necessarily faster, it printed somewhat better because of the orientation of the model on the Platinum, and then we just simply glue them both together. It's a large tree though, so that after we determined that it was too big, we made it smaller, and we'll print more of these. But that's basically a example, and this is the trees that we're using now from Safari. These are the tree tube you might have seen at any craft store. The reason we're using these is because they're in the appropriate height for the hills, which are 1 inch thick at the average elevation. So this tree is clearly very, very tall, and we'll make it probably as tall as these. But as you can see, here's another example of one of those pines right here. So this one, our tree is about a quarter, or possibly a third too large. And we'll fix that and print these guys. This would actually be better if it was a little smaller. So you can see 3 of these guys in a pattern, much like the 2 here, that would look pretty good. It would make a nice pine forest. So again, hot glue, glues them together, glue it on a base, and then glue it to a larger stand, or glue it directly to the stand. But the stands being just basic cardboard, not mat board, not very thick, means that there's a risk of them coming off because it's too flexible. So when doing something like this that doesn't have a base on it, it needs to be glued to a stronger piece of cardstock. Minimum, if not basswood, would be mat board, photo mat board. Okay, so that's that. We'll come back with demonstrating other operations.